Well, since we're on that topic, do you think a nuclear Iran can be contained?
No. I don't think actually a theocratic Iran can be contained even without nuclear weapons. I think there's a confrontation in our future between our civilization, I'll say that without embarrassment, the world that at least respects, if it doesn't always practice, the rule of law, and that has devised certain forms of diplomacy and certain systems of arms control to which the Iranians are legally signatories, and a regime that has the clearly expressed ambition to break out of and to trample all those conventions. We already see it in the threats to their Arab Sunni neighbors in countries like Bahrain, in their export of violence, as far away as murdering Jewish community leaders in Argentina, or Kurdish exiles in Berlin and Vienna, for heaven's sake, or a novelist friend of mine living in London writing fiction. I think they've asked for a fight and should know that on those conditions they certainly will get one. I was at the Hezbollah rally, well, so were you, in Beirut a little while ago, and I couldn't but notice that the party symbol of Iran's main client in that country, Hezbollah, is now a nuclear mushroom cloud. In cartoon form, the cartoon is made up of words which, when decoded, constitute a threat to the Jewish state, the Jewish people. Well, I wouldn't want to look back and think, I wonder if I should have paid attention to a threat like that. You may say one is alarmist. I could give you also all the reasons why that could be a bluff. They don't have it, they just want you to think they do. It's a way of aggrandizing themselves. I know that's all partly true too, but behind it there's a reality, and the reality would be the emergence of a thermonuclear theocracy. The one thing we've, since I was at school, been lying awake worrying about what happens when apocalyptic weaponry is grabbed hold of, laid hold of by messianic totalitarian forces. Well, we are about to find out. If we want to run that experiment, they're ready to do it for us.
So that's the worst. There are no consequences of an attack.
No consequences could possibly be worse than that, because I'm not one of those who thinks they would immediately use it on the Israelis, let alone on the United States. I think they want it for purposes of blackmail, principally against other Muslims and non-Persians in the region, or at least initially. The mullahs have a great racket, bleeding their country dry and running it into the ground and sucking out the surplus. Most of them don't want to give it up. But it doesn't mean that a later regime wouldn't be much more extreme, and they'd have the same weapons. So we have to take that into account. But in the meanwhile, we'd have to live in a world where, per force, we were polite and accommodating and agreeable to these characters. And I decline to live on those terms. I won't do it. The best speech made by Churchill on the most overused example, of course, of this kind of compromise. But still, I think the best and one of the least known, as he finally said in one speech, it's not that one objects particularly to any one policy, internal or external, of the Hitlerite regime. It's that you basically don't want to live on the same continent as them. You don't want to be breathing the same air. And in the long run, in fact, you aren't going to be able to. One of you is going to have to yield. There is, and I think should be, so I'm glad there is, a radical incompatibility between a civilized world order, which aspires at any rate to democracy and free exchange, and totalitarian, expansionist, fanatical regimes.
Did the overthrow of Saddam Hussein strengthen the Iranian regime, or is that question moot if they're simply next on the list?
If I was asked if the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime had the effect of strengthening the Iranian one, I think I'd have at least 2 or 3 replies. One would have to be yes in the short term. It gives it access to an audience of co-religionists within Iraq, who are by no means its puppets, but over whose leadership it does exert influence, not all of it financial, but some of it. On the other hand, it gives them the knowledge that on their near-abroad frontier, as with their Afghan one, there are forces that are keeping an eye on them, namely ours, and we're as near to them as they are to us, if you see what I mean. Bear that in mind too. I have some reason to think, from talking to Iranian dissidents both in Iran, where I've been, and in the diaspora, that when the Iranian people see free elections taking place in which Shia voters, they're not all as sectarian as that, but let's just keep it to that, and Shia parties compete against one another, they're not completely unimpressed. They don't want anyone to think, of course, that they would take an Arab country as a model. No Persian would ever allow that. But the free press, the satellite dishes and cell phones and the rest of it. These are unquantifiable. Well, that's harder to judge than the immediate influence exerted by Ahmadinejad on some Iraqi client, but they deserve to be mentioned too, and I think could equally be, not more equally be, could be more influential in the long run. Second, do we wish to go back to a time when Jimmy Carter was encouraging Saddam Hussein to rearm in order that he could invade Iran, apparently to do the United States a favor, in a war that failed to bring down the Khomeini regime, did strengthen the Saddam Hussein regime, did strengthen dictatorial tendencies in Iran, and not incidentally took the lives of perhaps 1.5 million people, and beggared the off. No, I mean, this playing off of Iran against Iraq is one of the foulest parts of our recent statecraft. What one wants is to end it by putting both countries in the control of their own people. And that might sound simplistic, but it could not possibly be worse than the competing dictatorship calculus which we operated on before.
So there's no point at which the consequences of the Iraq War would outweigh the
certainly
benefits?
not. Because apart from anything else, it's invariably a good thing to see Caligula on trial in front of his own people, with Milosevic, with Charles Taylor of Liberia, the invader and attempted genocide in Sierra Leone, where we prevented another Rwanda from taking place. Tony Blair getting, I think, particular credit for that in West Africa. And with the humiliation, I would happily call it, of Saddam Hussein in front of the people who he tortured and murdered and ruined for so long, and others too. No, one can't wish that undone, of course. And furthermore, not a small thing, we can now certify Iraq as in compliance with UN resolutions on weapons of mass destruction, which couldn't before. That's, by the way, that's a gain. Not knowing, not being able to certify, is a great source of insecurity and instability, by the way, as well as an outrageous breach of international law.